Welcome to another episode of the Confessions of a Recovering Landlord podcast, where you'll learn the secrets commercial landlords would prefer you not know. I'm your host, Jan Gibbons, along with my co-host and experienced commercial real estate broker, Bob Gibbons.
That's me.
Brought to you by Riata Commercial Realty, where we exclusively represent users of office and warehouse properties. Landlords have representation. Do you? Hello to all our podcast listeners. We're tickled to have you back. Maybe not as tickled about the topic today, little dicey, but we'll get into that. Going to start right off with real estate insights, because basically that's what the show's all about.
Isn't it always a dicey topic for us?
Well, the current state of the office sector, its opportunities and challenges. Is that broad enough? Am I painting it broad enough there?
Yeah, probably. Because, I mean, you're right. In every problem, there's an opportunity. So we just got to figure out how to find those, right?
Yeah. And who's the opportunity going to be for this time?
Yeah, good question. To be determined.
TBD. Well, the thing I thought was most interesting was, of course, we're talking about vacancy in office buildings and specifically in downtown areas. But the numbers, I think, were skewed in my view. I did not realize that the bulk of the vacancies are in a very small number of buildings. And so it makes it look like, oh my gosh, we've got such high vacancy rate, when it's really a selected few. Talk about that. What are they? Why are they selected few? I mean, there's other buildings that are almost 100% occupied. Or have low vacancy rates. And then there's a few that have this skewed number.
Yeah, I mean, and these are based on nationwide numbers that JLL came up with. And they claim that 60% of all office vacancy is concentrated in only 10% of the inventory, which is hard to believe, because I'm thinking, wait a minute, if you've got only 10% of the inventory is vacant, or have the bulk of the vacancy, 60%, does that really work? I mean, if you have 10% of the buildings have the vacancy for 60% of 100%, I don't know if this is making sense, but.
And then you carry the two donuts.
Yeah, 80% of the time I'm 100% right, I'm kind of looking at this, and then they say 90% of the vacancy is concentrated in 30% of the buildings. And so when you think about it in those terms, is 30% of the overall U.S. inventory enough to have 90% of the vacancy?
Well, those numbers are CBD versus greater metroplex area. If you drill down on that and get a little more granular, it talked about that.
Well, yeah, later it does, but in these big numbers, we're only talking about, right, the overall market. So I guess what I'm saying is, let's just pretend like you have a market that's 100 million square feet, right? And you have, say, 12% vacancy. So that's 12 million square feet vacant. But 10% of 100 million market is 10 million. So how do you have 12 million square feet of vacancy in 10 million square feet?
This is where my eyes start to glaze over. So,
well, part of the reason is because they say in 10% of the office buildings. Well, not all office buildings are the same size. And so you may have one office building that is almost totally vacant, and it's 1 million square feet, whereas you have another one that's, 10,000 square feet. So that's where this gets really hard to kind of follow, because it's, we don't have access to all of their research and all the numbers they've got here. So you just kind of have to trust that what they say is accurate, because they have research departments that handle this. But, as an example, just, one of the buildings here in the Dallas area downtown is a 63-story office building called Fountain Place, one of the nicest buildings in downtown Dallas, very iconic architecture. And it was built in the 80s, but it has, I think, what do they say, like 1 million square feet in the building, and 77% of it is vacant.
Mm.
Now it's more highly leased than that, but it's not, it's on the market for sublease and not being occupied. So here you've got a 1,000,000 square foot building with basically 750,000 square feet empty on the market for sublease or direct lease. And so it's pretty, I'm sorry, I apologize. It's 755,000 square feet is vacant and available for lease, with another 235,000 square feet vacant. So it's basically 1,000,000 square feet out of a 1.3 million square foot building that's available. So,
well, and a lot of times when people go home or hybrid or somewhere else, it creates that vacant feeling, and the people that remain don't want to come because they don't have that vibrancy in the building. So I think vacancy leads to more vacancy, and maybe the landlord's not keeping it up or providing as many amenities as when it was 80, 90% leased.
well, that's one reason why whenever you walk into a building, and especially if it's one of the older atrium buildings from the, the 80s, where, it's a big cavernous, all the way up to the sea, goes up 12, 20, however many floors, and it's a big open. Well, when you walk into the lobby, there's usually all glass. Every space has all glass facing into the lobby and the atrium. And so if all those spaces are vacant and the lights are off, it's depressing.
It is.
And so, landlords in those situations need to be creative. And, one of the things that that I used to do back when I was on the landlord side in that situation, down in Austin, this was back in the late 80s, like 89 and 90, 91. And we had a lot of vacancy in this building. So one of the things we did is we would have local artists display their work in those vacant suites. Well, and then we would have even the school district, the Austin Independent School District. We contacted their art department and had a big show where for like 6 weeks, all the art from the kids would be displayed, and then they'd have a big, reception and give awards to the kids, that kind of thing. So it was a great way to get people into the building, but it was also a great way to show some life and interest in.
Did it help with leasing spaces?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't really remember a specific deal that we got that we wouldn't have gotten had it not been for that.
That you might have kept people from leaving.
Well, it could have been that, but we also were creative in that we had some basement space, but that was open to the atrium, visible from the atrium, and we gave a discount rate to the Chamber of Commerce. So that also brought a lot of people to the building that wouldn't have otherwise come to the building. And back then, I mean, when we took over that building, it was probably 30% occupied. And it was the biggest, newest office building in Austin at the time, over 500,000 square feet. And so, yeah, we had to do a lot of creative things to try and get the building leased. Shout out to Ralph Beislein, who was our leasing agent at the time. So anyway, we're kind of getting off subject here, but bottom line is, I don't disagree with the JLL numbers that they have shown that there's a high concentration of vacancy in a smaller percentage of the overall buildings. And they also go on to talk about how those buildings were built in the 1980s and 1990s. And I've actually seen these stats from others that basically all of the new vacant space that has occurred since COVID started has been concentrated in buildings older than 2014. So, the JLL numbers were talking about 1980s and 1990s. The previous things I heard was that all the absorption, meaning new occupancy, was in buildings built in 2015 or newer. So, again, depending on how you slice and dice all this, really changes how you do it. One further stat on this is that according to the JLL report, more than half of all new vacancies that have occurred since 2020, despite representing only about 40% of the market, but more than half of the vacancy has occurred in those buildings in the 1980s and 1990s. So
talk a little bit about subleasing the sublease. It seems like this is starting to become a thing.
Yeah, there has been a little chatter about that. And I can't remember which article we were looking at, but there was one that it was talking about how some subleases are now on the market for sublease. And so I think one of the comments of that was here in Dallas at Granite Park in Plano, that company, I think it's Trintech, subleased 2 floors for 70,000 square feet. And now they have one of those floors on the market for sublease. And so, yeah, I mean, that is possible. However, typically a sublease, whenever you create a sublease, it has to be consented to by the landlord. So now you have the primary tenant, the subtenant, and now the landlord all have to agree on this arrangement. Well, typically the document that is signed to document the fact that all 3 parties are in agreement is the consent to sublease, landlord's consent to sublease. So you have the actual sublease, which is signed by the primary tenant and the subtenant, but then you have the consent to sublease, which is signed by the landlord and or all 3.
Cover that up real quick. You had a frozen moment there. I'm not sure what's going on with your feed, but
okay.
So the 3 parties are consenting to the original sublease. Go from there.
So you have 2 documents and 3 parties. Mm-hmm. So the 2 documents are a sublease, which is signed by the primary tenant and the subtenant. And then you have a consent to sublease document, which is signed by the landlord for sure. And then often the landlord, tenant, and subtenant. And so the sublease consent document usually says, and sometimes the actual sublease itself will say, that the subtenant is not allowed to sublease. So once you sublease the space, you're done. You have no right whatsoever to further sublease that space. Now, if the subtenant goes away, let's say a sublease is done, the subtenant moves in, and then 6 months, a year later, they default and move out of the building. Well, now the primary tenant can go sublease to someone else, but it's still just a sublease, not a sublease. And so if this property is now on the sublease market and they find a subtenant, then you have to now have consent by the subtenant, the subtenant, the primary tenant, and the landlord. So now you got 4 parties involved. And yet the landlord and the primary tenant are not obligated in any way to agree to that in most cases. Mm-hmm. So I've been involved in situations like that, both as the landlord representative and as a tenant representative. And back when I was the landlord representative, the primary tenant subleased to a company that was actually in the process of building a new building. But they were going to move into that new building within 2 years, but there was 4 years left on the sublease. So they had to do it. The primary tenant or the landlord was going to approve a sublease for less than the full term. And so 2 years later, the subtenant moves out into their permanent new home, and they try to sublease the building, the space. They find a subtenant, brought it to the landlord. Landlord said, no, we're not going to approve that. The primary tenant was fine with it, but the landlord was not. Why? Because the landlord didn't like the tenant, the new subtenant that was going to be occupying the building, and knew it was going to not help the value of their building. And also it was
it's not that they didn't like that subtenant. They didn't like the usage they represented, I think the biggest issue was they recognized that subtenant's use was also temporary, and there was no chance that subtenant would potentially extend for a longer time. Become a direct client.
Become a direct tenant, exactly. And ultimately, most landlords want a subtenant in the space because at least now they have some shot of keeping that subtenant, whereas the primary tenant, they've already moved out. They're long gone. Mm-hmm. They're never going to extend that lease. When I was on the tenant side, we helped a client sublease a space. We actually had this happen twice at the same time in different buildings. One was downtown Dallas in the West End, and one was out in the DFW Freeport near the airport. And in both cases, in the first case downtown, we represented the primary tenant that subleased. And then that tenant decided not to occupy the space, and then they found a sublease. And we were fine with that. The primary tenant was fine with that. The landlord was fine with that. Sadly, the subtenant, decided to go somewhere else. And even though we had everything in agreement, it never happened. The other one in the DFW Freeport, the landlord was fine with it, and the primary tenant was not fine with it. So my client was the subtenant. So they decided they didn't need the space after all. So we found a subtenant. So now we have the four parties. Landlord was fine with it. Subtenant's fine with it. Subtenant's fine with it. But the primary tenant said, no, we're not going to approve that. And why? They just didn't feel like it. They really never gave us a reason.
So basically, if there's a sublease on the market, most people are not going to go for that as their first option because there's so many parties to the contract that have to be convinced this is a good idea. And it's going to delay negotiations. And normally, from what I've seen, a subtenant is usually in a hurry. I need the space. I need it yesterday. I need it finished out. Yeah, leave your furniture. Just walk. So having those extra negotiations, I would think would put a damper on a sublease.
Yeah, you're right. The more people in a deal, the more ways there are for things to go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And the longer things take, the more things that can come up that will kill it. The number of ways that deals have died just boggles the mind. And every time I talk to, other tenant reps, around the country, around the world, and we compare notes, it just, you're left just shaking your head as I just can't believe that. So yeah, if I'm representing a tenant who's looking for space, we definitely will consider sublease, if we can find sublease space that will work. But if I know that it's a sublease, now I'm going to be a lot more cautious and try to make sure everybody's on board long before we get too married to that idea of being in that space. Because now you've probably also had to further discount it. So one of the other things about all this is that, in this discussion of subleasing the sublease, to sublease a space, often, at least in the Dallas-Fort Worth area for office space, you have to discount the rent from what the landlord would otherwise be able to lease the building for. You got to discount that from 15 to 20%, maybe even 30 or more, especially as you get closer to the expiration of that sublease when there's less time. Well, now you add a sublease in there, so now it's probably being discounted even further. So now instead of a 15 to 30% discount, you may be talking a 30 to 50, 60% discount. And so it's really attractive to the subtenant, but you don't want to get too far down that road and not know that it's really going to be something that you can get done.
Viable option.
Yeah, that is a viable option. Exactly.
So with the declining values of property downtown due to age, due to lack of vacancy, due to economic indicators, is this a good time to go out and buy me a 73-story office building in downtown Dallas?
Well, I wouldn't say just downtown. I think it's also in pretty much anywhere, but you're right. In most places, downtowns are the ones that are suffering the most. So that kind of depends on how you look at it. Today, is there a good deal out there? Some people think so. We have a client in Dallas, and they've been there for, boy, I don't even know how long, off the top of my head, maybe 15, 20 years.
I thought 94 was when the original lease was written.
Could be.
Anyway, for the prior owner.
We've been trying to, we expanded their corporate office, but we also were trying to, and we extended their lease, and then we also tried to extend their lease for it's a medical client, and so they have a clinic in the same building, and we've been trying to get that lease extended as well. And but a potential buyer of that building didn't like where that clinic was located. They had kind of a different idea for how they were going to re-amenitize the building. They have big plans for how they're going to really step that building up in the amenities. So all that kind of sounds good, but it wasn't great for my client because we couldn't get the lease signed on that deal. Well, now that building has sold finally to that buyer. It took, I mean, they were under contract for a long time.
I didn't know that. I thought the deal fell out.
It did, and it's now closed. So we can talk more about that offline, but
Yeah.
in any case,
The things I learn on our podcast.
there's a little something for everybody. But anyway, so so we were talking about values. So obviously that owner finally came to a value that not only was palatable to them, but also to their lenders. And
I was going to say
know,
the lending was what the problem was, I thought.
well,
The
perhaps. I
financing.
mean, I don't really know. I mean, we're on a podcast, anything I know is hearsay on that deal. So I can't really speak to the actual terms of that deal or what the reasons were for why it took so long. But given the lending environment over the time that was under contract, given that interest rates went up practically every month for 10 months, would lead you to believe that lending and getting a loan was a major issue in making that deal work, and every other deal out there. So values have.
Yeah, but I've got cash to spend.
So,
okay.
okay.
So I can pay cash. Does that make a difference?
If you've got cash to spend, is there a good deal out there? I would say maybe, but the problem is, in many cases, the landlords and the lenders are not yet ready to realize the losses they would have to incur to actually trade a property. So, if let's say, if a landlord has a building and they paid, say, $70 million for it, are they going to be willing to sell it for 50 today? Now, some have in other parts of the country. I haven't seen that happen in Dallas yet, but maybe it's happening. I just don't know about it, but it has happened in other parts of the country. So some landlords have sold buildings at a big loss. I've read about a couple of those in New York recently. In other cases, then let's say the landlord, the loan is expiring, and now the landlord is kind of forced to either refinance and bring a lot of money to the table to buy down the loan to value ratio, because now your value has fallen, and therefore you can't get as much. If you're going to get you can't get an 80% mortgage, but let's say you can get a 60% mortgage, and you paid $70 million for the building, is now worth 50. Well, 60% of 50 is a whole lot less than 60% of 70. Therefore, you have to come with cash to get a refi. So yeah, in that case, that landlord now has to decide, am I willing to throw more money at it, or am I going to just hand the keys back to the lender? And the lender has to be sitting there thinking, do I want that asset on my books? And once I get it, am I going to be able to sell it and get it off as fast as possible? So all these parties are having these same thoughts and discussions at the same time, and trying to figure out how to make that happen. So, you're a buyer, and you've created a fund. We call them a vulture fund, or an opportunity fund. If you have that money, and I see these announcements all the time of all these funds that have been created to go out and buy this kind of asset. So if you get lucky and you find a building where the lender's not willing to pay the extra equity down, and the lender is willing to take the building back, maybe that's an opportunity. And maybe if the loan is low enough, maybe you can buy it from the landlord before they actually turn the keys back over to the lender. But good luck finding that. I mean, there are lots of people out there looking for that right now at the same time, and that's going to be a difficult find.
What if I approach the bank and say, I'll take it off your hands, but I'm converting the usage? It's no longer be an office building. It'll be high-end luxury condos. Or will that sell better to the bank than trying to rehab an office building?
I don't really know that much about anything other than office and industrial. So if you're talking about conversions, everything I hear about converting an office building to a hotel or residential, apartments or condos is that it's extremely expensive to do that. And you basically have to write the building down to a zero value because the cost to convert is going to be so high that you can't make it work if you buy the building and then have to pay all the conversion costs. If it's already another kind of building in the first place, then, it's a different calculus. And I'm not knowledgeable enough on those other asset classes to really know the answer to that. But your question does raise an interesting question, which is, what is the best investment out there if you want to play in the office market? And according to David Rubenstein, who is the co-chairman of the Carlyle Group, big investor, he was quoted recently in an article saying that the single best investment that he knows of today is going out and buying the debt from the lenders for downtown office buildings. So, some bank or life insurance company or commercial mortgage-backed security has a loan on a building for, $50 million. You go in there and buy that loan for $30 million, $40 million. Well, if the asset is worth 70 and it had a $50 million loan and you're now coming in and buying the debt at 30 to 40, you're betting that lender, that landlord is not going to be able to pay is not going to be able to refi the loan. And now you've effectively, by foreclosing on that loan, you've effectively bought the building for 30 or $40 million.
Well, and the original lender would discount it to that extent?
Well, if they're looking at what's going on in the industry and they're seeing, little demand for office space, and they're seeing, values falling, well, they don't want that stuff on their books. So what are they going to do? Foreclose it, go through all that hassle and expense, and then go through the issue of foreclosing it, having it on their books. Now they got to figure out how to manage it. Who are they going to hire to manage it and lease it? Are they going to put money into tenant improvements and commissions? At the end of the day, they may be better off discounting the note and getting it away from them before they ever have to touch it or do anything with it than to go through all of that. And
do you think you're going to see a lot of that, especially in this area?
Again, that's a good question. There's a company called Capital Economics that has projected a 35% decline in values nationwide by the end of 2025 for office buildings. So, and they also further went to say they don't see a likely recovery until 2040. So, if you're believing those kinds of—
What number was that again? 20, 40?
A 35% decline by the end of 25. And no significant recovery of values until 2040.
So 15-year malaise.
So if you're a lender and you believe those numbers, then yeah, why not? So we'll go back to our example. So a $70 million deal that just lost 35% of the value is now worth $45 million. And if you can only get a 60% loan on that, that's $27 million. If you'd bought that building at $70 million and you'd gotten a 70% loan previously, that's $49 million. So now your loan's higher than the value of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's why when you start looking at these numbers, it's really a matter of who gets scared the fastest and how far are they willing to drop the numbers to get it off their books and not deal with it. I was actually on LinkedIn today, and one of our friends at Crux Workplace, David George, who we had as a guest on the podcast a while back, he just posted a survey that his firm did interviewing users of office space and asking them the question, are you going to be reducing your space? If so, by how much? Or are you going to take more space? And in their numbers, he says that their survey shows that 51% of the respondents said they're going to reduce their office space by more than 20%. And 14% are planning to reduce their office space by less than 20%. So that's 65% of the respondents are reducing their office space by some extent. And And that leaves the rest as maybe expanding or staying the same. So again, you throw those kinds of things out there, and it's not looking rosy for buildings that are older than 2015 or the 1980s, 1990s. But even then, it's not a one size fits all. I mean, if it's a 1980s or 1990s building that has been maintained well, has been renovated, has great access to walkable amenities and transportation, those buildings are going to do a lot better than something sitting out in an island somewhere. And that's why whenever you look in downtown Dallas, well, it's a mixed use development. It's got 2 office towers. It's got a lot of retail, or the capacity for a lot of retail. It's got a hotel, and it sits right on the Dart Light rail line with a stop immediately outside their front door. So if you're a big company that is thinking about relocating to Dallas and you need a big block of space, or, you don't need a big block of space, you need 20,000 feet, that's not a bad place to consider if it fits with your needs. Plus, you can lease that for a heck of a lot less than going to one of these brand new high-rise trophy buildings in Uptown, where you're going to spend $70 a square foot all in, versus going to the Plaza Americas, which is currently quoting 23 to 25 all in.
I think what you meant to say was, if they need 20,000 square feet, they call me and I will find them the best deal, which may or may not be the Plaza of the Americas. So
I like to leave a little something to the imagination. Hopefully
no,
it's not
I
a
don't.
good imagination.
No, come to mama. Well, to all our listeners, thank you so much again for your time. We love disseminating this information, even though sometimes it's painful. We think market intel is always appropriate.
Can I interrupt your little summation there real quick? Sorry.
Yeah, if you'll go ahead and sign off.
Well, a friend of mine also sent me a list of the big deals in the market today. And so it is interesting to see the big deals in the market and what constitutes a big deal. So big deals in the market, a lot of people think, oh, that's hundreds of thousands of square feet of space, right? Well, on this big deals list, there's one deal that is supposedly 350,000 to 500,000 square feet that is looking for space in Dallas-Fort Worth. There's another deal that's like 175,000, another deal for 100,000. And then there's a couple in the 75, 80,000 square foot range. And then it drops down to 50, 30, 20 in a hurry. So, looking at the big deals list, first of all, a lot of these are existing companies that are already in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So this would not be any net new space lease. Now, some of them are, but it's a little hard to say because some of these are undisclosed.
Is this all office, or is this industrial as well?
Yeah, this is all office. This is the office big deals list. And so it's interesting, but when you look at a big deals list like this, it's one thing that's hard to really determine is that going to result in any net new absorption, more office space lease than what was before,
right?
Because some of these will be an increase. Some of these are a reduction. Some of these are coming from outside the market. And some of these aren't going to be expiring for another 2 or 3 years. So even though they're in the market now looking, this won't have a direct impact for a few years. Now we can say goodbye.
Sign off. No, you get to sign off now. I already did the cute little sign off.
Well, you did do a cute. You do everything cute. So thanks for listening, and we will catch you on the next episode. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening. And just a reminder to send in questions to see if we can stump Bob.
Not going to happen.
We really appreciate your taking the time to tune into this episode. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star rating on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And if you are on our YouTube channel, we would love to read your feedback in the comment section. Also, be sure to subscribe so you get notified when we publish new episodes. Thanks, and see you next time.
Bye.